Okay, nice, we are recording. So I'm not seeing everyone in the Zoom room. Are you just seeing the 3 people, or can you see more than that? You're muted again.
The resident and an Ahoa, Brad Chatton and Betsy, then you and me.
Okay.
Oh. Do you see all those people?
I do not. I guess I could switch over to
I don't see all those.
participants on here. Okay, now I can see all the participants. Okay, we're going to, I guess with Will coming in, we'll wait just a couple of minutes for Will. We'll go ahead and get started about 1:03.
I figured you would.
Okay. Okay, we're here. We're ready to go ahead and start the meeting. Welcome, everyone. And let's see, Maria, and aside from the welcome, I will open it up for a minute for some questions. Rebecca mentioned some questions, any other initial comments. And then based on how the past couple of meetings have gone, we're going to hold back on public comments and questions while we're getting through the agenda items and reserve those for public comments towards the end. So that's when we can have more of an open dialogue and discussion about a broad range of topics. It's just sometimes some of the comments are coming in and they're a little off topic and we really kind of need to stick to the agenda. So just tightening that up a little bit. With that said, Maria, can we get the PowerPoint going?
See it?
Yes, we can see it. It's a slightly different view, but that should work.
You're getting the background? Hold on. Let me,
Yeah.
just a second. Let's see if I can send it to the other guy, other thingamabobber.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay, everyone, welcome to the Cannabis Ordinance Task Force meeting for today, September 26, 2022. And then let's move on to the next slide. Our agenda today involves a welcome here and a roll call of task force members. We'll do a quick consideration of minutes. We'll get into our consideration of amendments to the pre-application conference requirements, which is going to be the majority of today. While on the agenda, we had the consideration of amendments to the application requirements. We are going to hold off and continue that, and I'll explain why when we get to that point. But we did review a lot of it last time. It's one of the things that we'll get into more details that there's a lot of other stuff that we're going to be reviewing, such as zoning and land use issues and environmental and community issues. And perhaps just so that we don't repeat steps, we can maybe hold off on that. We've taken a good look at it, and then we can come back and revisit that so that we don't have to approve a bunch of stuff, then change a bunch of other stuff that would cause us to come back to it. So I kind of explained it right there. And following that, then we can open it up to public comments and questions, and then we'll go into a few slides over the next steps and what we can expect in the near future. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to a roll call. Okay, so for our roll call of task force members, I'm just going to call out your names and say present or here. William Weiss.
Present.
Jan Kuppinger.
Present.
Catherine Vanderwall.
Here.
Rebecca Harper.
Present.
Jennifer Smith. Let's see.
I don't see her online either, but Robert Geary just showed up.
She's not here, so Jennifer Smith is not here yet. Nara Delbaca, she had mentioned she will not be attending today. And then Robert Geary.
Yes.
Okay. All right, that concludes the roll call. And on to the next slide, consideration of minutes from September 12th, 2022. I had sent those out to all the task force members last week with the agenda. Are there any amendments that, or any issues that came up with the minutes from last time? Okay, no comments from last time. Also, I do want to mention, some people from the public have asked, Last week's meeting unfortunately was not recorded on the Zoom room. There were some technical difficulties that were kind of happening when we were getting set up, and the record setting did not get put in place. So we have recordings now available on the county's YouTube channel for the 3 August meetings, as well as today's meeting will be available. We do have the minutes from last week, and we have a PDF of the PowerPoint slides from last week. It's kind of a shame. I would really have liked to have had that recording from last week. We covered a lot of stuff, and it would be easy to refer people back to that presentation, but unfortunately we do not have that. So with that said, also we'll go on to the next slide, and that's fine. But I also want to mention one other thing. For all of the agendas, minutes, and PowerPoint presentations and any other relevant documents, you can access those documents now on the Lake County Community Development website. When you go to the CDD homepage, and maybe at the end we can see if Maria could share a screen while she goes to it. We don't have to do it right now, but if you navigate to the Cannabis tab, there's a drop down, and at the very bottom of that drop down you'll see agendas, minutes, and miscellaneous. And that's a web page with all of the documents from past meetings available up there. We're working with IT. They helped us out with that. There were some delays because there was some maintenance going on with county websites when we got started. So, you know, the rocky start that we experienced is smoothing out at the moment. So, yes, Will.
Just a quick question. You're emailing us, of course, the agendas for upcoming meetings. They'll also simultaneously be posted to that page?
Correct.
Great.
Yes. You know, in the past, it's been, you know, I guess maybe Wednesday, Thursday that I was getting you those emails. We're required to get them out and get it, you know, basically noticed 72 hours ahead of the meeting. In the future, you can expect it 1 week on the Monday before the meeting. So that is the goal that we have for that. So that gives people plenty of time to review some of the stuff and prepare.
Right.
So. Okay, moving into the first agenda item, which is the consideration of amendments to the pre-application conference requirements. Okay, as you recall, this slide is from last week. So this was our introduction to the pre-application conference requirements for all applicants and county residents or individuals pursuing cannabis cultivation in Lake County. They are required to undergo a pre-application meeting or conference per Article 27, Section 13, subsection AT2IB. And some of the basic requirements, actually the slide from last week had October 30th in it. It's actually the 31st, that was my mistake there, but it comes from Ordinance 3092. We went into some of the things that we generally address in those pre-application meetings, such as, you know, identifying license types. We look into address, legal lot of record, exclusion zones, all of this. Today, we're going to go into the ordinance sections, section by section, as the text in the ordinance addresses the pre-application conference. So due to that, I think that's going to probably take up the majority of today's meeting, and it's why we're probably not going to have a whole lot of time to dive right into all of the application requirements, in addition to other reasons that we should cover some other things first. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Okay, in Article 27 on page 21, that's where we dive into subsection AT for commercial cannabis use and the permitting process. When you go to subsection I for permits, and then B, minor and major use permits for commercial cannabis cultivation, the first section you come is subsection A. And this section was amended in Ordinance 3092. The previous slide reflects that. Currently, the ordinance reads, the property proposed for commercial cannabis cultivation shall be enrolled with the applicable regional water quality control board or state resource control board for water quality protection programs as of October 31st, 2020. Or the applicant shall provide written verification from the appropriate board that enrollment is not necessary. So, as I may have mentioned in the past meeting, this notice of applicability and the ordinance that requires it to be dated October 31st, 2020 or earlier, in some ways serves as an unofficial moratorium on new applications. We aren't seeing as many new applications. This could be correlated to the market conditions and everything that the cannabis market has experienced from last year. We also think it may be due to the fact that most applicants who have this notice of applicability dated October 31st or earlier, maybe they've all come through our system and we're processing all of these. But for the most part, we are seeing some new applications come in, but not nearly close to the volume that this department's experienced over the past 3 to 4 years. And the actual cause of that, you know, it's questionable. We can't say with certainty that it's because of this. I would like to open it up for, you know, consideration for task force members as to whether or not this, you know, language and having the moratorium in place, well, not moratorium, unofficial moratorium, but having that date for the notice of applicability in place is something that we should hold, or should we provide a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors to remove that date and open it up? Or, you know, there's various questions and views from it. And I think even for this topic, you know, we can, as long as public comments are addressing this topic, we can open it up to the public after all task force members have had a chance to speak to the issue. So with that said, I'm going to first refer to any task force members who have any comments or questions about this.
So I think we briefly talked on this at the last one. I was just trying to look, because isn't there still like a number of properties that have this?
There are,
The State Water
yes.
Quality Control Board contacted and.
Yes, according to Janae Fried of the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board, there are a lot of properties that still have the NOA out there within Lake County. And I think, you know, I don't want to misquote her, but I think she said the number in the hundreds, if not thousands. So there's still plenty. So that's why, you know, while we say it might be an unofficial moratorium, well, we can't say that with certainty. There's still a good handful of notice of applicabilities out there dated prior to this that may still be in the works. So maybe our slowdown in applications could be more directly related to the market conditions.
So do I understand it correctly? What this means is anybody that wanted to start a project today and didn't get enrolled with state water, they're just out of luck?
Correct, yeah.
Oh. Well, I think
Unless the property that they're
Was in
looking at was
before.
already in, yeah.
Even last year, staff was getting through our backlog of pre-application meetings. We had a good handful of, you know, interested applicants who had paid the fee for a pre-application meeting and scheduled them. And when I showed up, there was a backlog that we had scheduled out. I think we were doing no more than 12 a month at the time. So we would schedule those 12 out. And, you know, last year by the fall, by around September, October, we had gotten through the backlog. And it was only the last few in that list of pre-application meetings that we would get to. It was for the first time that I started to experience applicants who did not have the notice of applicability. Everyone that I, you know, through the summer into early fall, every pre-app that I did, everyone had that NOA from dated prior to October 31st, 2020. The last few were the first few that I had ever encountered that didn't have that, so we just had to tell them, well, we can't move forward with your application until that is either lifted or, you know, you can find a different property and come with a new pre-app with a plan.
Seems to me that removing the date, leaving all the rest,
Mhm.
that way we don't have to change the ordinance every year when the date passes or whatever, but it doesn't make sense
That's
to
how
me
the
to have
original-
something in place that nobody can jump into yet. 'cause it's-
Sure, yeah. That's how the original ordinance read, without the date. Will, you had a question?
Just the question of transferability of these NOAs. So if a property has, I mean, it was in step prior to October 31st of 2020, that can be sold or transferred via lease? Is that how?
Yeah,
that
my
works?
understanding, it's tied to the property.
Okay.
So, you know, property owners can come and go, applicants and legal entities can come and go, but the NOA is tied to the property itself.
Right, okay.
So, yeah.
If it's tied to the property and the property owner changes, But doesn't the property owner have to go through some kind of background changes? I mean, is there any kind of stipulation?
So in the watershed group, like if you bought a property from me and I already had one, you would just notify the watershed group that you're the new owner and they would transfer the APN to your name in the system.
I thought, I'd heard early on they were doing some kind of background checks. If you were a criminal, you couldn't get
That
licensed.
is something that, you know, if we were able to get into the application requirements today, like I had originally planned, but I think it's just too much to fit into one meeting. I had spoken with code enforcement last week and the sheriff's department, you know, as far as their input, we have, you know, one of our supervisors was gonna provide some input on that. There's arguments for and against that, so it's something that we'll need to be considering when we get into background checks, but we won't be getting to that one today. So there's a lot more to cover before we get into that.
But that doesn't occur with the region, with the water.
Yeah, that's not at this point, and this is really just, you know, as you're moving into a pre-application, having this ready is kind of one of the requirements, even though, like I mentioned, some pre-applications were scheduled when we found out they had a notice of applicability, it just wasn't dated prior to this date.
If this is being used as a mechanism to regulate the amount of projects that are, you know, able to be brought into the works, would there be any way if we wanted to keep some type of date there that we could, you know, just have water quality protection programs 2 years prior to the date of application or something like that, if we wanted to still use that as a mechanism as opposed to like removing the date entirely or changing it annually?
I guess that's one thought, or one approach.
I mean, I'm not saying that we need to keep it as a mechanism, but if there was any.
It could be,
Interesting.
you know, I think there's, other mechanisms that could serve the same purpose as we kind of get into the ordinance a little bit more. I mean, one of the topics that we'll eventually get to, that it's a topic of concern and even controversy, is having a cap on the number of cannabis projects allowed, and on what basis would we base that cap? You know, when we had a draft ordinance that came out from a previous draft ordinance and a recommendation, I think from one of the supervisors, there's a lottery system that was floated and people were, it was not received very well. I think we could have potentially, you know, I guess, more thought out standards for that cap, whether it's based on water use or, you know, environmental responsibilities. Yeah, something like that. We can get to that later. There's some good ideas when we do get to that topic. I think ways that the county can address that. But at the moment, you know, we're not quite there yet.
Well, and wasn't this put in as part of a way to help CDD kind of get through the backlog of the applicants, or?
Potentially, it was approved
Yeah, that would
before
make
my
sense.
time here. I think we could defer back to the original ordinance as to their cause. I think it was in response to one, CD's backlog of projects, and also as we entered a new stage of drought, you know, potentially to hold that off. If anyone can speak to that, I guess, have all task force members who wish to make a comment on it commented.
Well, I just have one thing, and
Uh-huh.
I guess the reason why that's in place would be what's important to us, right? If it was put in place because of the state of drought, that obviously has not improved. So removing it on that basis would not be reasonable.
Okay.
And to be perfectly honest, if it is in fact being used as a mechanism to meter the number of properties to which, you know, that would be approved for this purpose, I am curious what the other mechanisms would be. I realize that's off topic down the
Okay.
road for another meeting, but it's sort of like,
No,
how does one make a decision about taking the
Yeah.
brakes off here if there's not another option for down the road?
Yeah, if we're not sure of what that looks like.
it is quite relevant. In fact, you know, if we had, you know, perhaps Maria would be able to look up ordinance 3092 and skim through it, or, you know, some of the other supporting staff that are usually watching these and taking minutes, they're not available to do so. If we had a chance for a 5-minute break, I would love to go look that up real quick and come back. So maybe we'll revisit this before the end of the meeting if
Well,
we
it
have.
makes sense to me that when this first started, you guys were slammed. Everybody was chomping at the bits to get in.
Sure.
Now with the market dropping, all this other stuff, I don't think you're gonna see that kind of a slam again, because that was just I remember early on, people were just like wild horses chomping to get in there and
It
get.
was like a
going.
gold rush, you know, if you did follow that boom and bust kind of pattern. I think a lot of people expected it, they just didn't expect it all to happen so quickly. You know, these fluctuations in the market. So, it looks like Maria is sharing her screen and she is looking that ordinance up. So while she does that, you know, I guess I don't want to ask her to multitask. We can go ahead and open it up for members of the public to comment on this topic, and perhaps while Maria's looking that up, we could start with you know, we have 2 members from the public here in the conference room. Would you guys like to speak first, or?
Sure.
Zara, go ahead.
Yeah.
Please.
Hey, before you start, can you see ordinance 3092?
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
So Maria, it's a little tricky to read for me at least. Do you think you could go through it a little bit?
Looks like someone has their hand up, but still let me know. So a bunch of whereases. Let's see.
So if you make it a little larger, I can go ahead and read it. I just, you know, with my glasses.
How's that?
Here.
Okay, that's better. So, okay, the board, you know, with the whereas that Maria had mentioned, I think we can get through. I'll read that last whereas, or here we go. Whereas the proposed amendments are consistent with the provisions of the Lake County General Plan and Zoning Ordinance. Whereas the proposed amendments are necessary to protect the health and safety and welfare of the county. Whereas the proposed amendments will advance the goals of the county by supporting local and emergency businesses in the county. Whereas it can be seen with certainty that these proposed amendments will have no significant effect on the environment. The Board of Supervisors of the County of Lake, State of California, ordains as follows. Subsection A of section 27 AT2IB of chapter 21 of the Lake County Code, which is the Lake County Zoning Ordinance, is hereby amended and shall read as follows. And that's just as the previous slide read. The property proposed for commercial cannabis cultivation shall be enrolled with the applicable Regional Water Quality Control Board or State Water Resources Control Board for water quality protection programs as of October 31st, 2020, or the applicant shall provide written verification from the appropriate board that enrollment is not necessary. Before moving on, I did have this conversation, or this topic came up. Where is a situation where, you know, the applicant shall provide written verification from the appropriate board that enrollment is not necessary? The types of projects that we would see that would be for retail sales or manufacturing, you know, uses for cannabis activities other than cultivation, which use up the, you know, large amounts of water, basically. So, moving on, section 2, subsection G of section 27.3 AT 12 of chapter 21. Oop, lost it there for a little bit. Is hereby amended and shall read as follows. Application for background clearance. An application for a commercial cannabis cultivation permit shall do all of the following. Each applicant and employee shall electronically submit to the Department of Justice fingerprint images, So it looks like that section 2, if we go on to the next page, it looks like it's getting into background checks, which is a topic that we shall get to. So it looks like this ordinance is a handful of amendments all put together without necessarily a thorough explanation as to the Board of Supervisors' decision-making process. So with that said, let's go ahead and go to public comments on the topic. Zaro, back to you. Sorry.
Yeah, sure, Zaro Saraf, yeah. I think we should take off the date, because, you know, if the property is legit for, you know, to make application, why are we stopping the business? I mean, it's a lot of people looking Lake County, but they don't come to Lake County just because of that, because they won't be able to enroll, to set up the application. I mean, if they eligible with the water board, why we stop them? That's what I think.
Okay,
So let's monitor it. Let's say you have to be legit to the water board, but take off the date. So it's more opportunity that way. That's how I see it.
okay. That, we have heard that before. Paul, go ahead and state your first and last name.
Paul Bernaccio. So, two things. Obviously, with the date issue, I'm in favor of finding a way to relax it a little, just because one of the issues is locations, okay? Like, I know a lot of people that have these water board permits, they're in horrible properties that have no access, that are gonna cost you millions of dollars to bring to a standard. Nobody's ever gonna grow there, okay? But what happened was, is everybody knew this was a moratorium, and they thought, oh, I'll be able to rent this to a grower one day. So they just got everything they could done by the water board, okay? So yeah, there might be almost 1,000 available lots, but how many are actually gonna be used? Now, we've changed the location that we want these farms in several times over the past years. We used to want them out in the mountains, which is where I am, right? I'm all the way up on top. I'm in a terrible location to run a business, okay? I got bad access, it's hard to get trucks up there, it's hard to move inventory out of it, right? But I was a medical grower. A lot of these people are medical growers. So they brought their properties up to compliance, okay? So like Zara was saying, we have a new age that's coming where this is a real industry, a commercial industry, where we have to allow them to grow in commercial places. Right now, a lot of those places are being blocked because of this moratorium.
Okay.
So I would just, yeah.
All right, thanks, Paul. Let's open it up to the Zoom room. Maria, do we have some hands?
Yeah, we do have one hand up. Caller, go ahead.
Hi, are you waiting for me?
Yeah, go ahead,
Yes.
Bart.
Thank you so much. This is Bart Levinson. In the budget hearings this past week in the Board of Supervisors, Patrick Sullivan said that the revenue, the taxes and fees collected from marijuana were expected to be only around $4 million.
Bart?
In the
Can I-
August 15th meeting, Andrew, you said that the county is reaching its cultivation capacity. I'm wondering how to bring those important pieces into the discussion at this point.
Okay, Bart, for now, those are decent topics, but I'm not sure if I necessarily mentioned that we are reaching our capacity. We potentially could be. We haven't confirmed or denied that, but it is something we want to look at. And I guess that is some relevance to the moratorium. But do you have a specific comment as far as this date for the notice of applicability from the water board?
Is this the same date that people have to declare whether or not they're growing for the year?
No. This is a notice of applicability that an applicant needs to obtain from the water board, from the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board. And it's required that it's dated before October 31st, 2020. So pretty much all of the applicants who have obtained that NOA from prior to that date, we're wondering whether or not they've all submitted their applications and whether or not we should remove that date from the requirements.
Thank you. I do not have a comment about that.
Okay, thank you, Bart. I think I saw a comment that one person on the Zoom room, their hand wasn't being shown as being raised.
Oh, I show somebody called resident with a hand
Okay.
raised.
Let's go ahead and go to resident.
Is that me?
Sounds like you, yes. Who is
Oh,
Oh,
this?
no, I think we're both unmuted now, but go ahead, I'll wait.
Oh, you go ahead. I'm sorry. I'll figure out this hand raising situation. Thank you.
All right,
Okay.
thank you. Andrew, this is Angela Amaral. I had a question. How many NOAs are there currently in the county? Do you have that on
I
hand?
do not. That is up in Reading with the Central Valley Regional Quality Control Board. I have spoken to Janae Fried up there, who kind of oversees Lake County. And she says there are still several more available, hundreds, if not thousands. I tried calling her this morning. I couldn't get through. I wanted to get a an exact figure and invite her to be a part of this conversation.
Okay, I would just like to recommend, we might want to consider keeping the date the same, at
Mhm.
least until, the drought emergency ends. We have a better understanding of what the farms that are already permitted use. And also when the GSA is completed for the groundwater sustainability, because that's still an ongoing process, but those are my recommendations.
Okay,
Thank you.
those are fair recommendations. Before I respond to that and all of the suggestions, I think there's one other person in the Zoom room.
This is Trey Sherrill. I'm trying to figure out the raising my hand
I
situation.
think I
don't know
see your
why.
hand now.
Oh,
so-
okay. Yeah, I just wanted to voice my support of what Paul had said. Basically, this date was originally intended to kind of put a cap on the number of applications the county would accept. And we're not going to see the kind of green rush that we saw years ago. I just can't imagine that continuing given current situation in the industry. And removing that date would allow those who are still interested in moving forward with cannabis projects in Lake County the ability to more intelligently plan the location and scope of their projects without being locked into these properties that were permitted or registered with the regional board prior to that deadline.
Okay, well, that is a good point. Thank you, Trey. And thank you for all the public comments. I think they all make sense. I don't think this date was meant to be permanent. It was never really meant to be permanent. As to whether it was to address the high volume of applications in the backlog or whether it was to address the drought, that cannot be determined at this time. I think we could do a little bit more, research and dive into the topic a bit more as to who decided that. But, is there, now I'm going to go ahead and close public comment on this topic at this point and bring it back to the task force as to any recommendation or suggestions they may have as far as keeping the date or keeping it temporarily or, removing it under certain conditions or, Will, go ahead.
Question. So what if you removed the year on the date, but kept October 31st? Wouldn't this meter how many per year could be considered or evaluated for approval if there was a sort of like whoever was approved prior to October 31st or had an NOA prior to October 31st of the previous year? I don't mean to direct this only at you, Andrew. I'm sort of voicing it to the group, but just sort of curious if the mechanism here is whether intentionally or unintentionally a metering that perhaps needs to be preserved for the sake of whatever. And I'm not necessarily saying that's the case either. I mean, I don't necessarily feel that way, but if it is in fact serving that purpose, wouldn't the same be achieved by limiting it to a certain number per year?
Well, I think that's where eventually when we get to land use and environmental impacts and a potential cap on projects, we could, achieve the same thing without having this NOA date.
Fair enough.
I'm not sure if removing the year would really make any difference in terms of processing applications or having applications available, or properties that could potentially be used for commercial cannabis available to move forward in the permitting process.
Is the state on time? If someone applied now to get in with the State Water Resources, would it take months to hear back, or is it something that they're pretty prompt at? Because
That's
California is
interesting.
pretty slow with most everything else.
I do know that from that time, maybe some of the people who have been through the application process can remember or relate that, when this was put into place, there was a huge volume to the water board, and it took them some time to issue those. And even if, let's say, they weren't issuing it till January or February, but they received it just right before this date, they would still backdate it to that time. But it created it created a big, I think, hiccup in their own department, based on this, whether it was intentional or unintentional. I don't think anyone intended to do it, but it was an unintentional side effect of the ordinance itself. So it made it hard for them. And I think they've even asked, when are you going to remove that? So, I'm not sure if they're out here looking at our properties all the time anyway, with or without this, they're still overseeing water quality here in Lake County. So,
I just have varying feelings about this. I mean, in the instance that the state is being used in close relation to drought conditions, that makes sense. But if this is more of a way to meter projects, I just don't see this as being the most responsible way or the most fair way, or, I mean,
sure.
equitable in any any way you put it. I don't see this as being a good way to meter projects. If you have somebody who wants to come in right now and is going to have a responsible grow and is meeting all these components, to say, oh, well, too late, but all these people who maybe aren't as responsible for you or who weren't as thorough as you can, just because is not, I just don't see that as being in the county's best interest. But I do think that if we are wanting to meter projects based on drought, maybe we could do that in a different way.
I would bet we have some other mechanisms in place, don't we? I mean, if without that date, if somebody wanted to,
Not necessarily. It's a brand new industry. Even reviewing cumulative impacts is tricky with the new industry. So how about this? This is a big question. It does need to be addressed. Maybe we shouldn't do it so quickly. I think I could go back, do a little more research on this topic, get to the heart of the issue, and get to the true intent of passing this and what it was for, and maybe bring it back for a motion at our next meeting.
could I ask?
Andrew,
Yes?
if I was there when they started doing that deadline.
Well, thank you. Please, we have a living memory here.
It was entirely because we were watching the 700 to 1,000 application flood in Humboldt. And the board was concerned that staff was going to burn out and quit and leave. And so they didn't want to seem like it was a merit-based limit or a random lottery limit, because those legally are kind of iffy. So they just used this as a deadline.
Okay. Well,
Can I say something? When
we did
oh, is the public?
close the public.
And
comment.
also
Good.
Jennifer Smith has her hand up too.
Okay, let's go to Jennifer Smith as a task force member, then I'll open it back up to public comment. So, Jennifer, you are here. That's good to know. Hi.
I would like to see this discussed at a later date.
Okay.
It was a metering effect. And I think as we go through this process and reevaluate the zones that we might be allowing to cultivate cannabis, there may be some very viable and better suited parcels that become available that will then be hindered because of this date. So I think this is something we look at a little bit later in this process.
Okay.
I was wondering if it'd be possible to get ordinance 3092 emailed to me. I just can't comprehend stuff reading it on my phone, but I'd like to read the whole ordinance just to know that we're not making decisions.
Okay. We did look at it there, and it didn't really.
I have a hard time on the phone. I'm up on Cobb. I don't have good Wi-Fi. It's just.
I'll tell you what, so looking back at the agenda was consideration of amendments to the pre-application conference requirements, which we will be covering. We're diving into the very first section of that right here. And then consideration of amendments to application requirements. In a lot of ways, while this is placed within that group for pre-application requirements, it really does fall on application requirements. So we could very well revisit this when we get into the application requirements, which won't necessarily be next. We need to get into all the land use zoning issues, look at exclusion zones and setbacks, look at environmental impacts, look at community impacts, then come back to application requirements, and maybe that's the appropriate time to revisit this topic, especially when we can take a closer look at the environmental issues that we're facing. So
I just sent in a request to Sarah to have somebody print a few copies and run it down to conference room B. That way you can take it with you.
Okay.
Thank you.
That sounds great. Okay, well, with that said, I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the next slide. We're gonna revisit this
Oh,
with application.
you said you would open up public
Oh.
comment for him.
Zara, yeah, sorry,
I just
public
want to
comment.
make a comment. It's a lot of mechanisms to determine availability, eligibility for the application. If you take the date, you know, Lake was revising it, Mariah's revising it, Andrew and his, crew, it's go over it. So like he said, it's a lot of setbacks. It's a lot of things that if you're not eligible, you're not gonna be. But just the date, it's gonna stop you, because let's say you buying last year, you already passed the date. You're not gonna even buy it. You're not gonna pay taxes, start looking Humboldt or start looking Trinity, which is, I don't think it's good for the county.
I don't think so either.
So if you take the date, it's a lot of things that we can, you guys, not we, you can determine if it's okay, if it's gonna go further or not. That's what I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point. I think, we've seen a lot of good points with this, but I'm gonna go back to that comment unless there's anybody in the Zoom room. I don't think there are, and we did. Okay, so public comment was open and closed again. Thank you, Zara. I think we should revisit this with application requirements after we, take a thorough look at every other aspect. And it basically is an application requirement as opposed to a pre-application requirement. So with that said, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide and really dive into the pre-application process. Okay, so when we go to page 121, after A on the notice of applicability, we get into B. And this is really the beginning of where our pre-application requirements start. And subsection B reads, the applicant shall schedule and pay the fee for a pre-application conference with the department prior to the submittal of an application for use permit. Questions regarding a specific application will only be addressed at a pre-application conference. No later than 2 weeks prior to the pre-application conference, the applicant shall provide the department, and wait before we move on to the next slide. So this is basically where our pre-application process starts in the ordinance. A few things to take note of is that the applicant shall schedule and pay the fee for a pre-application conference. I just want to remind everyone that that fee is based on our hourly fee schedule, and we allocate 2.5 hours to the pre-application meeting, which is about all the amount of time that staff has to dedicate to these. Is it enough to fully review and analyze a project? Not really, but a lot of times at this stage, people don't really have a good idea of what their project actually is. They're looking to, embark on the process. And this is a lot of times it's a good opportunity to stop someone from going too far down a dead-end path before they spend too much time and resource on it. So that's really the beauty of the pre-application. When I conduct my pre-applications, I'm looking for red flags, just immediate red flags that'll jump out where we can say, whoa, this doesn't look like it's gonna work, Otherwise, we, tell them, okay, well, this is an issue, but you might be able to address it this way accordingly. So with that said, let's go ahead for what the applicant should be submitting then. So no later than 2 weeks prior to the pre-application conference, the applicant shall provide the department with a map showing a lot of record, showing where the cultivation site is located, and the assessor's parcel number or APN number for the lot of record. 2, a sketch of the proposed cultivation site, including the location of the canopy area, full cultivation site, access, existing structures on the lot of record, any water bodies and or water courses. That's what the ordinance reads. We put in a couple of notes, perhaps, identifying any off-site residences that are near the property, any proximity to exclusion zones. It is something that we do look at when we're conducting our pre-apps with the applicants. Staff is generally looking at our GIS layers, not so much off-site residents, but we definitely check exclusion zones, the existing exclusion zones. Those are some of the red flags. We aren't necessarily jumping into any schools and daycares in those locations. And off-site residences, things that come up. And so it's maybe something you guys consider. you should identify those at the pre-application stage, or we identify those later when we really dive into a full application. And whether or not this is something that the applicant should bring to the pre-application meeting. I want to keep that in mind, that these are what they need to submit 2 weeks ahead of time. So if we leave it up to them to identify these things. Let's go on to the next slide. 3, they need to provide 2 weeks before the pre-application a statement as to which state license, or I put in parentheses the S, the applicant intends to submit an application, and again, a parentheses 4 could go in there. And responses to the following performance standard questions. So before we get into those, let's bring up for conversation and consideration state licenses, whether or not they need to determine their state licenses at this point. It's something that's kind of hard to do from my experience working with applicants and pre-applicants, that state licenses have a various number of combinations. You could have different licenses for the same parcel. It's not like this parcel of this size, you can only do this license. You could do a handful of different licenses or a handful of different combination of licenses. And oftentimes that gets worked out through the application process. So whether or not, we could require a statement, we just need to realize it's subject to change. So
They're not locked into it. If they put down one thing and change it 2 months
at
later.
that point, no, they're not locked into. A lot of these projects, and it's something I'd like to reiterate to the public, that they're works in progress. They often, submit one thing, we get feedback, then, this agency says this, so they modify it here and they change. A lot of times the finished product at the end can look quite different than what was, initially embarked on in the beginning. So, but moving on to the responses to the following performance standard questions. So requiring this response 2 weeks ahead of time is something that we should take a look at. There's a series of questions. This is the first of them. Has the applicant applied to the Cannabis Cultivation Licensing Division for a cultivation license if the application relates to an existing site? So the question seems pretty straightforward and not a big deal, except the departments have all changed at the state level. I highlighted, or I bolded and underlined the Cannabis Cultivation Licensing Division because various divisions have changed. We have the Department of Cannabis Control is what we work with, DCC. Who knows when or where the state could change departments again? We can't predict that. Hopefully they've landed upon something that will work. But with that said, and again, trying to mirror state regulations, this is a good example where we could amend the ordinance and make it a little more dynamic so we don't have to revisit these hard specific details. We could simply word it, has the applicant applied to the appropriate state agency? Language like that can leave it open to change at the state level. So that's one example where we can kind of choose our words to make the ordinance itself a little more dynamic and a little more robust.
Right, and I would agree with that type of language because
Mm-hmm.
it has changed names and divisions
Yes.
several times. So
Yeah, it's,
I think kind of just leaving it like whatever state agency is responsible for licensing, some kind of generic thing.
okay,
So
yeah,
that way if it changes again in the future,
we're still
our
covered.
ordinance is still,
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
All right, well, I don't need to make a note of that. Moving on to the other questions. So, again, subsection 4, responses to the following performance standard questions. Question 2, is the cultivation site located outside a floodplain? That's something to think about. Is that a requirement we still want to look at the pre-app level? I think that's fine. In terms of whether or not we want to allow any projects within a floodplain, right now, we don't like to see projects in floodplains. We identify it. I think that's worth keeping, but that is the main point of that question. 3, do all aspects of the project not require a grading permit? And then how many cubic yards of soil is proposed for removal? I highlighted that part just because it just seems like a strange way to phrase a question.
Terrible.
Do all aspects of the project not require? We could just simply say, will any
Will a
grading
grading
be
permit?
performed? If so, to what extent? So, really, we don't have to change the the intent of that, we could just rephrase it in a way that is a little more user-friendly and easier to understand. Next, does the applicant have a legal on-site source of water? And then in parentheses, this is getting into more environmental issues, but, depending on what type of legal on-site source of water is there and available, to what extent should the water availability dictate the project? I mean, a lot of that's up to the applicant to determine. It's their business risk, but their business risk could impact the environment that we all share. So that's something that we should keep in mind. So, does the applicant agree to monitor water use and share the data with the county? It's a good question to get a clear answer on right in the beginning because it is a requirement. Let's see. Robert Geary, do we have a comment? Maybe, maybe not.
No, I do. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I'm on my phone and so I don't know how to raise my hand through my phone. So,
Okay, that's fine.
yeah, no, one of the things that I think I do have questions on is that, we're talking and we're asking at this early stage about grading, ground disturbance already. I think maybe one of the things is just to see also at this early stage if there are any known, maybe archaeological sites or cultural sites, or maybe even a question about, have they reached out to any of the local tribes, maybe to come and maybe, survey the area for possible, cultural resources. Because I think we're already asking about ground disturbance, about grading, and we're also asking about water. But we're not asking about anything. And there's a lot of people, especially a lot of the landowners that are around here, like really know the property really well. Like, I hear all the time, oh, well, yeah, there's a place here that they used to do this or something. So I think if we can get that early on, when it comes to the actually permitting process, we're already ahead of the game of knowing how sensitive it can possibly be, just from the knowledge of the landowner.
Sure, that's great. That is very.
Yeah, and one other thing I also wanted to add also was, I think it's really important to put at this early stage that, this is, however we want to word it, let's word it that this is not a permit to start, because early activation permitting really kind of gave us a big headache, because people were on the assumption sometimes of thinking, okay, well, this is early activation, so I can start my project. And this is prior to any AB 52 going out. And then when we get there, we'd see, already ground disturbances that's already happened. So I think it's really important at this early stage that, some wording in there basically saying that, this is not a permit, this is, construction or any kind of work, prior to this cannot happen. However we want to word it, but just to be able to note it in there. So they know that this is an early process. This is, a pre-application. This is not, a green light for, construction to start. Just to kind of cover it, I guess, from just learning from, this last experience.
Okay, no, that's a great point. In fact, we touched upon that last week as far as providing a list of, tribal contacts that they could reach out, a full comprehensive list from all tribes, as opposed to trying to identify which, tribal territory they might want to look at. That kind of disclaimer is good. I think removing early activation from even being an option will address most of that, but we can't necessarily make an assumption that somebody still might not get the right impression, because we are still dealing with this issue. In fact, we'll get to that with next steps. But no, I think just, because here we've decided that the board within the county, no more early activation. We can't guarantee that everyone out there is following and is aware of what's happening here. We're seeing some situations where even with early activation and no county permit on the table, people who have obtained their state licenses feel like, oh, I've got my state license, so I'm good to go. We're starting to see a little more of that. So that's, it brings up another example of, kind of where people getting ahead of themselves in terms of actions taken for these projects. It's still always going to be there, and it's going to be something we need to address. So, maybe, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I know, right? I mean, I think you hit it like on the head, because I think once, especially if they have, had gotten their license already, everyone's really hot to go to get it started. So I think there's got to be verbiage to let them know that, hey, there's still a process that has to be followed. And we should ensure that, because like I said, there's been a lot of times where we've been out on sites where a lot of stuff has already been done prior to actually, getting their actual permit. So I think to kind of alleviate that problem, we need to be really specific and make it, visual, that they can see in their process that, hey, this, you don't have the green light yet. There's still these things that you have to go through. So.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think it kind of connects to something I was thinking about as I was preparing this. We require responses to these questions, but they're kind of preliminary. Maybe we could separate the questions that we know for sure are going to apply. Do you agree to provide water use, water monitoring and water use data? You're going to have to do that. We know for a fact. Some of these statements we could turn into like a signed agreement at the beginning, that they could sign that we agree to all of this. We agree, we acknowledge that this is not in any way an approval to start. That way you have a signed document from them that we know they're aware that we've covered this, and you cannot embark on some of this stuff ahead of time until everything is done. So it's a possible way to address this. Rebecca.
I had a question, but you kind of answered it. I was just going to ask what the merit of asking somebody if they agreed to do something that they have to do if they are going to have a project, and you kind of answered that with the signed agreement. So
Okay.
I have a question. Does any other industry have to report their energy data, their water data, and all of that to the county? Do we hold vineyards and all that to that, or is that just unique to marijuana?
Not necessarily. Cannabis is going through a unique process. But with that said, also, Maria, if you can hear, I think you're 2 slides ahead. And also, Robert, there's a question. Maria went 2 slides ahead, but there is one of these questions is, have you conducted a cultural or archaeological study at this point? So that is one of these pre-app questions. We were still up, previous slide, I think.
Oh, right there.
But that's where it says it was on that other
here.
slide. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we did move on. Okay, sorry, I apologize, Maria. You were on the correct slide.
Problem, Jennifer has her hand up, and then when you're opening up to public, Bart had hers up, and then Betsy has hers up.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and then let's get Jennifer's. Okay, Jennifer, if you want to go ahead. So.
I just wanted to point out, I feel like a lot of these things are essentially non-negotiable, so I don't know that they need to be framed in the like a question. It's a check. It's really like, here's your, these are mandatory things, right? Like, we want an archaeological and a bio report. We want their water board NOA. We want these things are mandatory. It shouldn't be a question, and they should be a part of the pre-application process.
Okay, well, that is a good point. I think these
the state requires them. You're going to have to go through this process to even assess if your property is viable. I've done archaeological studies and bio on properties that I was looking at buying for cannabis projects, and they've come back in a way that I've decided to not even move forward.
Okay, that is a good point. I looking at the ordinance, and it's an opportunity for us, again, to not just change the rules and regulations for cannabis, but to clean up the way this ordinance reads and works. We would like to see something that's a little more streamlined, a little more user-friendly. People can navigate more clearly. This has subsections and subsections and subsections, and we can maybe improve that readability and question these questions. Why do they need to be questions at this point? Maybe we should just have submit a signed statement that, all of these things are applicable and they need to read it, as opposed to coming up with a written answer to all of these things, which, is a little more cumbersome to the applicants in an already very, extensive application packet for these cannabis permits. They're probably some of the most extensive application packets I've seen for any use permits from my experience in planning. So, Rebecca, yeah.
I kind of wanted to touch on something that Jan mentioned a second ago about the water quality reporting. So I know in the first section that we looked at, we talked about you know, applying to your applicable regional water quality control board and their water quality protection programs. And one of those protection programs would be the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. That is a program that all growers, that is the program that requires all growers to submit their water quality management data, nitrogen management data, all of those things. I managed a sub-watershed for Lake County, and I just wanted to add that there aren't very many growers enrolled in that water quality protection program in Lake County. So I'm kind of interested to see what the regulatory process we have going on is, because I didn't know that cannabis growers were required to comply with water quality protection programs, and I would know if they were in that program, which is one of the main programs for Lake County. So that kind of raises a few questions for me. Just looking at if that's really being followed, which I know is off topic, and we've decided to move that. But I did just want to throw that out there because you mentioned that, and that ties kind of directly into the enforcement of some of these items.
Yeah, no, it's
Trey
relevant.
Sherrill is Trey's online and he's a great resource to answer that question specifically.
Okay, so when we open up for public comment here in a second, we can get to that, but
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
not a question though. That was a statement. I do not have a question about that. I'm
well, it's relevant and it opens up like a much larger conversation on water quality, water rights, water availability, which we will be, focused on for at least probably 2 meetings coming up when we get to the environmental section. I think that'll be the heart of the environmental section. So, anyway, with that said, let's open it up to hands raised in the Zoom. I'm seeing 3 hands raised. So, let's see. First one.
Bart's first, then Betsy, then Trey.
Okay. Hello, Bart.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Thank you so much. I'd like to bring everybody's attention to an amazing presentation that Robert did with the Planning Commission that detailed exactly what's involved in monitoring, looking for artifacts and things of archaeological importance in soil disturbance. And I'd like to suggest that the term soil disturbance be figured prominently so that people understand that they cannot just launch into disturbing the soil. Something that happened to my neighbor is that a neighbor bulldozed 900 feet of a property line because they thought it wouldn't be objected to. And there is no mechanism, it turns out, to address that without going into a civil lawsuit. That's an example of what Betsy was talking about last meeting, how incredibly fast, enormous damage can be done.
Okay, Bart, I'm going to bring it back to the pre-application requirements. So that's an excellent point. And yeah, we did mention Robert's presentation. I do recommend everybody go check that out. But as it relates to the pre-application process, I will take that suggestion from you to maybe change the phrase from grading to soil disturbance, just so it's clear for everyone at the pre-application level that is that issue. So, let's move on to the next comment. Betsy.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I have 4 questions. To start with the last one, who was the person who said that they are managing a sub-watershed for Lake County?
Me, Rebecca Harper, Lake County Farm Bureau Executive Director.
Thank you very much. I'll contact you separately about that. So you're the Farm Bureau Executive Director, is that correct?
Yes, and the sub-watershed for Lake County is managed by the Lake County Farm Bureau Education Corporation.
As I said, I'll call you, at the Farm Bureau, to discuss that. Thank you.
Okay, and Betsy, we're gonna open up for general public comments at the end, but if, we'll take comments on the pre-application process at this point, so.
So, excuse me, yes, I have those questions. And I don't know if you've shown us the entire list. I wonder if there is a requirement for notifying the impacted areas around the property that will be affected by the operation. That's one question.
Okay, so in terms of notifying surrounding properties at the pre-application stage,
Yeah, is there a requirement for them to do that?
not at the pre-application stage, no.
So my next question is, I think it was something about sharing their water use, agreeing to share their water usage data.
Yes, it's a requirement.
Who would they be required to submit that data to?
Well, they submit it to CDD in their annual reports. So essentially, this is ahead of their approval for a permit. When they're looking into pursuing one, we have a pre-application meeting and we ask them, as you move forward, do you agree to submit this? Because you will be required to. So it's more or less clarifying it. But at the same time, do you think they should be required to provide a written statement as the ordinance kind of says it at this point? Or is it something that we could state, like Jennifer Smith said, there are going to be requirements anyway. We could list them out on a document and maybe they could sign that document at the pre-application.
Well, my last question has to do with that. You're just taking a statement from me saying I've done all of the above. Yes, I've done it. Is there any requirement for the planning person to verify that they've done?
There are, but at this point, they have no permit. They're not allowed to do anything. They're just signing. As you move forward in the process, are you aware that you will be required to do this? That's
good faith statement.
That's the question ahead. It's a good faith statement, but it's also clarifying so that later on, planners could, in terms when we do get to violations, and Betsy and Bart, I think a lot of your concerns you're going to be very interested when we get into our violations meeting, and I'll mention some of that in the next steps. But having a signed document from the beginning, you signed, you were aware of this, and then, 2 years down the road, we see these violations, even if they're not permitted or, let's say they get a state license and they start moving forward. We'll get to that in a second, but it's a very good comment. We'll address that. But at this point, it's just more or less getting the applicant or pre-applicant at this point to acknowledge that they understand that this will be a requirement. So that's all we're at right now. So, but with that said, we'll move on to some
One more question.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Is this a complete list, or what I'm thinking about is for manufacturing, sanitation? Some of the products used in manufacturing have destroyed our sewer treatment plant at Lake Special Districts.
Okay.
Because it kills the bugs. Is there anything in there to tell us what's going to happen with their waste? Is it going to be assessed and analyzed, and are they going to have, hydraulic?
Well, let's get through these questions and then we'll check that.
I think there was one more hand raised also, Trey.
Trey, okay, go ahead, Trey. Let's have this as the last public comment. We'll get through the rest of the pre-application section so then we can open it up for a complete conversation, because I think some of these questions will be addressed in some of the items that have yet to be presented, so.
So my comment was questioning the need or validity of requiring a pre-application conference. Maria, I think maybe you remember this, but when the requirement first came about, it was same kind of deal as with the requirement for the water board permit deadline. It was a mechanism to kind of slow the number of applications that the county had to accept at any given period of time. Though there was a limit of 12 pre-application conferences per month and 12 applications that the county had to receive per month. I personally remember sleeping on the courthouse steps so that we could be one of the first 12 for various projects. And I just don't think that these mechanisms are going to be necessary going forward with the industry and with permitting in the county. And then just one like side comment, I guess, was about the irrigated, the comment about the irrigated lands regulatory program. Just, I know this is side, but that cannabis is not allowed in that program. It hasn't been since day one. And anyone enrolled if they have acreage enrolled with the irrigated lands regulatory program, they have to remove that acreage from their enrollment if they converted to cannabis, because that has to be enrolled under the cannabis general order. Thanks.
I do remember the process of setting up those pre-app meetings, and I think that slowing it down was sort of a byproduct. It was actually more of a response to staff resource availability, because we wanted to go through these, because a lot of the people applying had never, they weren't really familiar with the program, and so we were trying to get the best applications that we could by setting up these meetings, but we only had so many staff members that we could only spend so much time. And so that's how we came up with the 12. So slowing it down, that was definitely a byproduct, but I don't know that that was its primary goal.
Okay. Well, it reminds me of a topic that came up last year with the limit of 12 per month, in the sense that, at this point, the county is and has been pursuing various cannabis grants from the state. And I think there was a certain level of grant funding that we were not eligible for because of our limitation to, I think Mendocino got like 10 times as much grant money as we could, because they had no limit on the number of pre-apps per month or these notice of applicability. So it did cut us out from a lot of state grant funding that can help the cannabis industry. So for your consideration. All right, well, let's get through these questions before we comment on each and every one, and then we'll open it up for a broader conversation. So just a few more slides here. So the next question, does the applicant agree to make water sources available to CAL FIRE for firefighting? Next, question 7, it looks like, has the applicant conducted a cultural or archaeological survey of the property? And does the applicant agree to monitor energy use and share the data with the county? And does the applicant agree to monitor vegetative waste generation and share the data with the county? Next slide, please. And, okay, that sounds about right. Does the applicant agree to monitor solid waste generation and share the data with the county? And does the applicant agree to monitor water quality of storm water runoff and share the data with the county? And any other questions that the applicant may have regarding the permit process or what is required for the submittal? At this point, they can submit the answer to those questions and any questions they have 2 weeks before their pre-application meeting. And that is what our ordinance states. I think there's one last question that kind of got thrown in there. It's on the next slide. And do you plan on using CO2 enhancements? That was kind of put in there. Seems like not a horrible question, but maybe in the wrong place kind of question. I'm not sure we should be addressing that at that point in the pre-application meeting. Generally, if they are, this is, it's something we see more with indoor cultivation than with outdoor cultivation. I have no background in cannabis cultivation, and I'm not an expert on agricultural practices as well. So some of this stuff is new to me. So I was hoping maybe someone in the room could provide any more information on CO2 enhancement. But in cannabis, I understand it's generally a enclosed greenhouse activity. So anyway, we can get to that with open discussion. Let's move on to the next part of the pre-app requirements in the ordinance. So all of those questions need to be answered, submitted in writing before the pre-application meeting. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, and to the full extent. But we generally get the application, a site map, a site plan, what they want to do, and the planners they dedicate about an hour to looking into that ahead of time and going through a checklist that we have, which was mentioned in that very first slide, also a slide from last week, of all the different things we look at and look for red flags. Now, moving on to the ordinance, it says at the pre-application conference, the department will provide a determination of the legal lot of record status or request additional information to make such a determination. The lot of record where the cultivation site is located is required to be a legal lot of record. Now in red, I have a preliminary question mark, whether or not this should be a preliminary determination. Keep in mind, staff only has 1 hour. We have a few quick ways to check to see if a parcel has a legal lot of record, but it's not exactly exhaustive. With that said, maybe we could add the language preliminary in there just to let you know that we're not doing a thorough search. The next one, a determination of current compliance with chapters 5, 13, 17, 21, 23, 26, 29, 30 of the Lake County Code. Compliance with these chapters is required to submit an application. This is another question whether or not it's there, because other than that statement right there, we don't really see it too much throughout the rest of the zoning ordinance. And again, is it a preliminary determination? Determining this is almost impossible at this stage, whether or not they're in compliance with all of these chapters. And as they move forward in the application process, before any application can be approved, they need to clear those, clear that they are not in any violation with any other part of the municipal code, according to either Article 50.4 for minor use permits or 51.4 for major use permits. So having it at this point, we need to keep in mind the ordinance should really only include things that, we can enforce. We can't really fully check that at that point. As, they move forward in the application process, we'll receive an application, we'll check it. Eventually we'll do a site visit where we can take a closer look and we can highlight any violations. Sure, we can do a preliminary check and see if there are any open cases from code enforcement. That's about the best that we can do at that stage. And even with just an hour to prep for these meetings, it's a little tight fit. So something to reconsider. 3, a determination of the performance standards score based on the responses to the performance standards questions. A minimum score of 75% is required to submit an application. Now, this had a lot of planners that I've worked with and current planning staff a little, we're wondering what, because it really does look like it stems from outdated internal policy. When I started working in this department, we didn't score it and give you, if you got a 7, if you got a C or better, you get to move forward with your application. It was more a pass fail. Either there's no red flags and you look like you have a green light to keep moving forward, or there's a red flag, we highly consider pursuing another project. So whether or not that section should be in there, we're not really using it at this moment. I'm not sure what that score was based off, so it seems a little random. Maria was here in the past. She might be able to speak a little bit more.
I do remember that.
Okay.
And this, a lot of our conversation today actually is reminding me of what Jennifer said in the first place. A lot of these things are really required for an application. And so it's not, so I think that we could actually revamp the whole PV checklist to say, these are required for your application rather than asking every individual question. But you're right. The minimum score of 75 was for us to be able to show the applicant that you got a lot of stuff to work on if you want to turn in an application at this location. So that was kind of just a visual cue.
Okay. Well, there's the consideration, whether we can continue with that visual cue or whether it's applicable or not necessarily applicable, or whether it was addressing something that was of concern in 2018 that here 4 years later in 2022 maybe doesn't apply so much anymore. So the next one, let's see. At the pre-application conference, the department will provide a response to the questions submitted with the pre-application conference application. Okay, that's fair enough. And an outline of the information required in an application, which would be our next item for consideration. So moving on, the recommendations for amendments to the application requirements. Again, we shall continue that to another time because we need to dive into some of the key issues for land use and zoning, then the environment, then the community, and then come back and revisit everything we're going to require based on those decisions. Perhaps at this time, it might even be too early to, make a motion for the pre-application meetings. I'll leave that up to the task force, whether they want to make a motion or whether they would request that I revise this based on any suggestions that I can, take comments on. I can review the recording, and come back next week. We can get that out to you a week ahead of time for your review, and then you can make suggestions. At this point, it is up to the task force. So
And this is for the pre-application process, everything that.
just pre-application. I figured we have enough to kind of amend the pre-application and, take some items into consideration, but you might want to wait and see how the bigger picture plays out and then come back to that, just like the application requirements. It's
I
your
think
choice.
definitely, I'm only speaking for myself,
Mhm.
but I would like to see it more as a written statement.
Yes.
Like
Okay.
they agree to these terms instead of asking it as questions. So maybe that's something they have ahead of time and they bring in with them. And then you have that signed document that they're fully aware of what's expected of them.
Okay.
That would also eliminate that 75% evaluation
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
said is so not really even applicable in a lot of cases anyway, or not to,
And in terms of streamlining it frees up staff time to review those questions, create responses,
Yeah.
when they're gonna have to redo all that,
I mean, the answer has to be
reviewing
yes.
documents to review documents to review documents. Within the department, we have a phrase, more work for the work, which, happens quite often throughout this process and something we try to avoid. So streamlining it could be that. So,
And during the pre-application, are you checking to see if they have legal use of the property or no?
we remind them that they need property ownership approval, which is required. That is a required part of the application packet,
Okay.
which is also something that I mentioned last week that I think we should also revisit maybe more than once as far as requiring property owners to be co-applicants in all these projects, so.
You've got storm runoff and water quality, but I still don't see sanitation sewage. If they're manufacturing and it's going into any kind of a holding tank or a public sewer, it needs to be ran by whoever manages the sewer. And
Okay,
a lot of them used Action Sanitary pumper trucks.
true.
Same thing, destroys the sewer process when those pumper trucks drop. I can show you pictures that are just
That's good to
devastating.
know, it's something that
Yeah.
hasn't been to my attention. at
It's
this point.
lye, alcohol, all kinds of things they use that
Yeah.
just kill the process.
Okay. I think it's another reflection that in this early stage, so much of this permitting process was just geared towards cultivation. We're seeing the cultivation applications kind of work their way through our process, and the new applications we're seeing are for manufacturing and distribution and retail sales, other uses. So, yeah, that is something that we could potentially add to that written statement. So, any comment? We got two hands raised, but they're from the public. I'd like to go back to, I guess, Jennifer and Robert, as far as task force members in the Zoom room. Do you guys have any suggestions or comments? Okay, I don't believe so. So I'm taking, I basically, the recommendations and that I'm receiving, I'm kind of picturing that I can come up with a written statement before the next meeting, and we can make a motion on that written statement as a pre-application agreement. So, if that's what,
Well, maybe that could just be a
or-
draft document until we kind of get through things to see.
Yeah.
okay,
I mean, if there's any, because, we might come up later, and be like, oh, maybe this element. needs to
yeah,
be-
keep it open as a working document throughout the rest of the process. Okay, that sounds good. With that said, let's open to public comment. We got two hands in the Zoom room, but we got Zaro here. Zaro, go ahead.
You said it's 2.5 hours from the staff, right? But that's 2.5 hours just for the pre-application, right?
Well, how the 2.5 hours generally break down, it's about 15 minutes for one of our staff members, generally an office assistant or technician, to set up the file, get the file to a planner, create the hard copy as well as the digital copy, get it into the system. That's about 15 minutes. Then it's about an hour for research from the planner who takes it. They got about 1 hour to go through, look through, go through their checks, try to figure out if it's illegal out of record, check the soils, it's kind of a race. I've done this many times. In 1 hour, check so many different aspects and cover red flags. Then we have about a 1 hour meeting to go through all of those checklists, which, I've gotten my routine down and I just write at 59 minutes quite often. And then it leaves about another 15 minutes. We like to follow up with an email because always getting it in writing and sending it back to the applicant helps. Also, staff had experienced times where they covered stuff in a pre-app and then the application moved on, and then later the applicant said, well, you didn't tell us that. And we're like, well, yeah, we did. And it gets to, a disagreement. So having it in a follow-up email in writing is beneficial. So.
Okay. Yeah, I've been in my trip. I did that before.
Yeah.
A long time ago, but I did it. And I remember that it was quick because I got a checklist before you even go there. It's been a couple of months. There was a COVID, so I had plenty of time to go to the list. And I remember when I sit at the window, the guy just gave me we just write it down. He just said 1, 2, 3, 5. Bring that to the pre-app. So if you make a list for them before you even go to when you sign up for the pre-check, and 5 things, 10 things, wherever we decide to go.
Sure.
And if you go there 2 weeks before the meeting, they can submit the answers. Or even there, it's going to take no more than 30 minutes to go, on the list and see if they qualify to apply for the application.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I think is going to save time for you, for the applicants, pre-applicants, and they can determine if they're going to go further or not.
Okay.
I mean,
a list of a few items. Honestly,
because a lot of the stuff you don't understand you understand, but it's kind of like you read it and you don't really know, should I go with that or should I don't go with that? So if it's a simple question, check your legal status of the lot. You go on the second floor, you check it out. It's 5 minutes. They go through the documents because you guys are not connected. Or maybe you are now.
Well, we have access to some of the documents, but we don't.
But you don't
go to
further.
them for every legal document.
Yeah, I remember that was an issue with me. So I can do that, save time, and sit down for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, done. I go further or I don't go further.
Okay, no, that sounds good. So kind of cut down on the list of things to submit. Honestly, like key thing for me for a pre-app as a planner is a preliminary site plan. Just give us a sketch of where the cultivation area is, where the canopy is, and I can identify most issues. I think did I see that Robert Geary was trying to say something? I want to check. I thought I saw his.
Yeah, no, I was just wanting to comment about, I think it was like one of the last things that you were speaking about as far as this is going to be something that we're still going to continue to work on. The gentleman that was just speaking, I totally agree. I think if there's like a checklist that even when they come in for the review or they come in for the meeting to go over items that maybe they have forgotten, if that's something that, when they start to go in for a pre-application, for the pre-application process, like there's this checklist of they know exactly what to bring, what to have on them. And that'll save a lot more time, I think, for the administrative portion of it. So you can get on to the next one, right? And so I think it makes it a lot easier for that to happen. I think that's something that is really needed because there's too much confusion, I think, of exactly like what's needed sometimes, I think, when you get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think that's just something that it makes it a lot easier if you could, I'm a visual person, if you give me a form and look at it, I have to fill it out and this is exactly what I need. And really in just kind of layman's terms, it's like really simple, you know what I mean? I think it makes it a lot easier, the process a lot easier, and it streamlines a lot of stuff.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that kind of summarizes or sums up the sentiment of a lot of these comments. Let's see, we have 2 other comments in the Zoom room. Looks like Trey Sherrill and then Bart, I'm guessing.
Sorry, I think that's left over from earlier. I'm good, thank you. Sorry.
Okay, Bart.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. I want to strongly agree with Robert Geary, Maria, and Jennifer Smith and others who've spoken up in this meeting to ask for a much clearer checklist up front so that people are informed of what they're going to be required to do, told to do, the way they need to prepare. Case in point, your application asked a question of, will you have water available for firefighting? I'd like a much more specific requirement that CAL FIRE produce a checklist of how, what criteria needs to be checked on and checked off to have a grow site properly prepared for fire preparedness, for firefighting, and evacuation.
All right, thank you, Bart. We do, it looks like a comment from residents. So before we address that, let's go ahead and.
I'll make it quick, Andrew. This is Angela Emerald.
Angela.
I just wanted to state that, yeah, it would be better just to have it as applicant must agree to all the following performance standards, just to make it a little bit more condensed. And then also, while you're reviewing for next week and creating a checklist, if you could look into, because I noticed that you said that there was a 75% scoring before the application moved on.
Oh yeah, but I think we're looking at removing that.
Okay, but if you could look into and or point me in the right direction of who to talk to find out where the breakdown was for the applications, because as you know, you're the first planner who's ever reached out to us to get an approval. So I want to find out where that breakdown, where was that gap at, and that we need to address in there. If
Okay.
that makes sense.
No, it does. I think what you're referring to was not a cannabis project, but I did reach out to your property owners association, but they should all be reached out to.
Right. So yeah, with your that planning project, that was the first time we had ever been contacted. So prior to that, there were 2 cannabis applications that made it all the way to the planning commission before we found out about it. So that's where I'd like to find out where that breakdown was. If you, or just point me in the direction of who to talk to, I appreciate it.
Well, we brought it up, perhaps on that checklist, you know, we could have a comment towards HOAs and POAs and, you know, just checking to see if you're in that location and does your HOA or POA allow for commercial activities, so.
Thank you, much appreciated.
Okay. All right, well, with that said, I think we have a clear idea of coming up with a draft pre-application agreement and a draft pre-application checklist moving forward. Yes, Rebecca, go ahead.
Sorry. My question is just that with the pre-application agreement, we would be requiring pre-applicants to bring in that verification, right?
Well, that would be the checklist. The checklist would be, you know, bring
Right.
us,
So
you know, these handful of things we need to, you know, really take a quick look, a pass-fail kind of look.
Perfect.
You know, either green light or red flag. And the agreement itself is just reiterating what's already going to be required as they move forward.
Perfect.
So just making sure that they're aware of some of those key requirements right from the beginning. So I guess that's where that would, that's the purpose it would serve. So with that said, can we go back to the PowerPoint? Maria, we can't see you. I hope you're enjoying that snack. Oh, also Bart, we do, there's 4290 requirements. I believe if it's a 2,500 gallon fireproof, whether it's metal or fiberglass tank that CAL FIRE requires for these cultivation sites. So we'll get into that later, but there are clear-cut requirements on that. So towards the end, there's a few more slides. Oh, right here. Okay. So we can, after I get through these slides, then we can maybe open up the remainder of the, oh, we're already a little over time. So maybe we can get back to public comment at the next meeting. So things to follow in the next steps. We're going to start looking into land use and zoning issues in more detail. We'll first visit the basically allowable zoning. What zones do we want to allow these projects in? What types of projects? There's basically a table in the ordinance that allows you to see which kind of activity is allowed in which zoning with which kind of use permit which brings us to the next topic, minor use permits versus major use permits, and what are the differences and what our current requirements are and whether those are relevant or we should revisit those and change those. Then we'll be looking into the state requirements and regulations before we move on any further to see how closely we can align ourselves with what the state requires. And we can take that information and apply it to our existing exclusion zones and any potential future exclusion zones, as well as setback requirements. So those are some of the things to anticipate as we move forward through our land use and zoning section. Then we're going to wrap all of those up with basically conclude that section with a group of recommendations that we can bring to the board before then moving on to the environment and the community. In fact, before we get to this slide, well, I'll get to the slide in a second here. But one thing I would also like all the task force members to keep in mind, tomorrow at the Board of Supervisors meeting, I believe an ordinance is going to be presented that gets into ag exempt hoop houses and ag exempt processing facilities, temporary structures. So it's basically going to be presented at the board. I would like, if you have a chance, to check that out or maybe go back and watch the recording later. I think then it will come to the task force for a quicker response and recommendation. It'll go just like the early activation came here first for recommendation, then planning commission for recommendation, then we took it to the board. We're going to have a similar process with this new draft ordinance that's being presented tomorrow. So keep your eyes.
Tomorrow's agenda item is strictly to see if there is will at the Board of Supervisors level to have it go forward.
Okay, so it's something to keep your eye on. That yeah. So we will see if there is will for it. So and moving on, finally, the next one, I did want to bring up this topic because I know some members are really quick to get on this, and looking at violations that are out there. I would like to remind everyone there is an amendment to Article 7 of Chapter 13. It was in ordinance number 31-2, and it refers to violations of high severity. If you look in that amendment in section 1350.3, there are penalties for high severity of violations, especially for cultivating cannabis without the proper permit. There's a scale of a per plant penalty, and it goes up to, if you have 50 more plants, it's $500 per plant per day once a notice of violation has been issued. So keep that in mind. It's something that we're seeing with some of these projects. We are kind of increasing our cooperation with code enforcement and the sheriff's department to see who they are looking at. And code enforcement, I would like to highlight, they had a goal of addressing, I think they had a goal of eradicating and abating, I think, 10,000 illegal cannabis plants. I think right now they're closing in on 20,000. So they are out there in force. So a lot of people have the impression the county isn't doing anything and illegal cannabis is going crazy and wild, but it is being addressed. We are working with the sheriff's department for a handful of pending projects who apparently, went ahead and cultivated this year, without early activation or for whatever misunderstanding or confusion may or may not have been in place. The fact is they're cultivating, illegally. They're operating without their proper permits. And within that same ordinance, for those projects, there's permanent ineligibility where they are permanently ineligible from a permit. So I just wanted to bring that up, that, the county is addressing a lot of the concerns. And there is language in other ordinances that address a lot of the concerns that we're receiving from the public. So with that final note, we can open up to any other public comments before adjourning.
Yes, I have one.
Oh, hang on, Bart, we're gonna hear from Will.
Sorry, just wanted to figure out, you went through a moment ago the next steps. What are all of those to be included in the coming meeting or spread out over a
They'll be
few?
spread out, probably a meeting, dedicated to each topic.
Got it. Just checking. Thank you.
So those probably our next 4 meetings, and that should conclude the land use and zoning phase. Then we'll get into environment and then community. So roughly about 4 to 5 meetings per section that we're looking at. So,
Thanks.
And any other topics as they come up that we need to address, so. All right, Bart, you had mentioned a comment. Let's go ahead and hear from you, and then I think we're gonna have to adjourn the meeting. We're already over time and
Thank
people
you.
have things to do, so.
I'd like to make a request that roads be entered into the pre-application interview and checklist so that when people come to speak to you about applying, they have an idea already that how many trucks and vehicles will be using the roads, whether the roads are evacuation routes, whether they have shoulders, and what their plans are for getting in and out.
Okay, well, we will take that comment and I'll try to work it into these working documents that we'll be drafting, I'll be drafting, so. Okay, thank you, Bart. Thank you, everyone. With that said, we're gonna go ahead and adjourn the meeting, unless, Maria, anything?
I just want to ask like 5 minutes after the meeting done.
Oh, after the meeting,
Yeah, I just want to
we can go up and